This Choircast podcast is being brought to you by Rituals for Heretics. For millennia, people have been meeting deep psychological needs through religious ritual and meditation practices. Rituals for Heretics takes rituals and meditation practices from all kinds of religions and deletes the God part of it while leaving the psychological work that is being done so that you can put whatever you believe or don't believe about God back into the ritual or meditation practices. Get your copy today on Amazon or wherever you purchase books. Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast. I'm Jeremy, and I have a treat for you today. We are talking to Dr. David Orsman. He is a homiletics scholar, teacher, author, retired United Methodist minister. I'm also a United Methodist minister. He spent 17 years in pastoral ministry. He's also earned a doctorate in homiletics in the New Testament studies and has taught at the Pacific School of Religion, very close to where I used to live in Silicon Valley, and the Vancouver School of Theology. And he has a new book called One Life, Four Stories about the Gospels, and we're going to get to talk to him about it. So, Dr. Orsman, thank you so much for being here with us today.
And thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. So you've got this book, One Life, Four Stories, and basically you are making this argument that the four Gospels shouldn't be harmonized, like flattened into one. I think you call it cookie cutter Jesus, and I love that idea of the cookie cutter Jesus that most people carry around in their heads. And so I think just to start, what do you mean by that? Like, what is the cookie cutter Jesus that you feel like most people carry around in their heads?
Well, the church over the past 2,000 years has tended to do this, especially after the Council of Nicaea, when Constantine wanted a very diverse church to create one version of Jesus, one version of the faith that everybody could center around. And so Constantine basically did away with the very diverse understandings of Jesus that the church enjoyed in the first, second, and third centuries and tried to impose orthodoxy. And of course, orthodoxy has gone in a million different directions. You've got, in today's church, we've got Methodists and Presbyterians, Arminians and Calvinists. We've got people with a liturgical point of view. We've got evangelicals. We've got Christian nationalists.
Right.
Spiritual, not religious. People who understand Jesus as a great ethical teacher. People who see Jesus as having died for their sins. There's more than one cookie cutter Jesus, but people tend to have one image in their mind. And when they pick up the Bible, they tend to read through that lens. So that you only notice what you're expecting to see and you miss everything else. And I think we lose a lot in that process.
Mm-hmm. And so can you give me a sense of just one of those cookie cutter Jesuses? What do people think and see? How do they imagine Jesus through that lens?
Well, let me put it this way. We're going through Holy Week now, so I might start with that. And there is the version of Jesus that the church proclaims during Holy Week. And different churches put out different versions of that story.
Uh-huh.
But the stories are so different. So that let's just take hopefully we can cut out this.
Sure.
So people, churches will follow the story of Holy Week. So for instance, just Palm Sunday, which we celebrated 3 days ago, Jesus goes into the city. And in the Gospel of Mark, what do the crowds say? They say, "Blessed is the King who's coming in the name of the Lord." And how did it sound to the Romans, who more than anything else want to prevent an insurrection from happening? And so when Mark writes this story in 70 AD to what I think is a frightened congregation, because Jerusalem has just been destroyed and the temple has just been demolished, and they hear this story about Jesus being welcomed as somebody who's going to bring in a new kingdom. It says, if you look at the actual Greek in the Gospel of Mark, when he preaches in Capernaum, they were terrified. They were struck with terror. The NRV translates, they were astounded. The NIV translates that they were amazed. But you see, those two translations are really buying into the cookie cutter Jesus. They're into the version that the church has adopted for 2,000 years, I think, to some extent, unconscious that they're even doing it.
Right.
We just read, we see what we expect to see, even if we're scholars or scholars.
Well, and at least the NIV has a sort of well-documented evangelical bias in their translation committee, and all of that as well. You started to bring up something that I think is really interesting and helpful in the book. You talk about like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not as just storytellers or historians, but as like pastors addressing communities in crisis. So I'm wondering if you could sort of walk us through, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What are the crisis, or are the crises in those communities that they are addressing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So Mark, who I think was writing in 70, and whose church I think was based in Galilee, not in Rome, as the tradition says. Galilee is just 100 miles north of Jerusalem. The people in Galilee would have heard that the temple 90 miles away had been demolished, that 100,000 residents of Jerusalem had been killed. And Mark tells the story of Jesus preaching in the synagogue at Capernaum and says, literally, as I pointed out, they were terrified at what he said, because what is their agenda in a community that is so close to the destruction that's taken place? They want to fly under the radar. They are frightened to death. And so they're silent in Mark. 15 or 20 years later, by the time you get, say, to Luke, a lot has changed. You're a generation away from the destruction of the temple. It's like being a generation away from 9/11, and the receded into the background. And for Luke has a very different relationship with the Roman Empire. Luke and his predecessor, Paul, has been engaged in taking advantage of the Pax Romana and sailing all over the Roman Empire and preaching the gospel in Turkey and Greece and Rome and starting churches. And Luke appreciates the Pax Romana and the mission it makes possible. So that, for instance, in Mark, Jesus goes into Jerusalem and the crowd say, "Blessed is the one blessed is the King who is coming in the name of the Lord." In Luke, it says something along the lines of, It speaks of Jesus as somebody who's bringing peace,
Hmm.
reflecting the same thing in the angels' song in chapter 2. So,
Hmm.
so Luke is making peace with the Pax Romana.
Uh-huh.
Luke is not putting down the Romans at all. In fact, he's reaching out to Romans and other Gentiles. And the first convert in Luke Acts is, not coincidentally, a Roman centurion, a Roman soldier. So
Yeah.
Cornelius becomes one of the heroes of Luke. So whereas Mark is very has an apocalyptic point of view towards Rome, wanting God to come in and overthrow the Romans, and Mark thinks it's still going to happen. For Luke, it hasn't happened. Luke wants to smooth things over with the Roman Empire and peace. And his narrative, Luke Acts, ends where? It ends in Rome with Paul proclaiming the word boldly without hindrance. So he's portraying a sympathetic Roman Empire. So I think that's an amazing difference.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. And so what I hear you saying is that each of these crises are informing the text, but not just out of because it is the water the writer of that gospel is swimming in, but also because that writer is sort of directly addressing the crises, right?
Exactly.
So can you give me an example of that, like where one of these writers is sort of, speaking to the audience in that moment?
Okay, here's another example I can give you, and it will help differentiate Luke and Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
So Luke was a companion of Paul, at least according to tradition, and certainly theologically. Luke is presenting Paul's point of view. In the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, it comes to a climax in Acts chapter 10 when Peter has... He's hungry. He sees all kinds of unkosher food coming down from heaven on a sheet, and he hears, Peter, get up, kill, and eat. And what does Peter say? Peter says, I've never eaten anything unclean in my life. But he hears 3 times the same, get up, kill, and eat. And so Peter gets the message that the Torah has been abridged and that Christians, Gentiles in particular, do not need to follow the food laws. So switch to Matthew and look at what Matthew's Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. In a passage that we don't pay that much attention to, probably because it's not as famous as the others.
Right.
Matthew's Jesus says, think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets.
Yeah.
I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill it. And whoever breaks the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Who do you think Matthew has in mind? I think Matthew has Paul and Luke in mind. I think argument going on in the church, which should not be unusual because there's an argument going on in the church today. The huge thing. The Bible includes both, which is a way of saying you don't need to take one side of the argument. The important thing is to be open to each other and to honor the conversation. I think that's what's on in the New Testament. And we don't do that.
Yeah. So, that distinction, I think, brings up another interesting thing from your book. And that is how Peter changes sort of dramatically from one book, one gospel account to another. And I'm curious, could you tell us how is he different, and why is he different in each of these texts?
Okay. Again, a very interesting question. And The differences of the four Gospels stories of Peter are dramatic. So in Mark, Peter really comes across as a failure.
Mm-hmm.
Peter denies Jesus 3 times after saying he wouldn't.
Right.
At that point, he breaks down in tears, and you never see him again in the story. Peter is the one who got to the point where he declared Jesus to be the Messiah, the first to do that. But then Jesus rebukes Peter and rebukes him to silence, and then tells the disciples what his ministry is about.
Mm-hmm.
Says, may this never be. And he rebukes Jesus. And then Jesus rebukes Peter and says, get behind me, Satan.
Yeah.
In Luke, none of those rebukes take place at all.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is that Luke is doing something different. Most scholars think that Luke was written for a Gentile audience.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense if you look at who the characters are who appear on the stage of Luke. They are all pious, religious, observant Jews.
Yeah.
And so what I think, and Peter too, who says in Acts 10, I've never eaten anything unclean. So what Luke is doing is preserving and building the reputation of Peter so that when Peter finally is converted by his vision to the notion
Mm-hmm.
that the church need not keep the Jewish law, the Orthodox observant Jews who've been reading Luke up to that point have been following along, admiring Peter, who, by the way, at his call is portrayed as a prophet.
Right.
He's called when he catches the miraculous catch of fish, and his response is to fall on my knees and basically say, I am unworthy. Get away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man, which is how the Hebrew prophets responded to their calls. Luke, pricing Peter as an Orthodox Jew who has been called as a prophet, who sees this vision, who announces it to the church, that you do not need to follow the law. Matthew goes in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
Peter's confession in Matthew, Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and you will have the keys of the kingdom, and whatever you bind will be bound on earth, and whatever you loose will be loose on earth, which is rabbinical terminology.
Right.
Peter is given the authority, according to Matthew, to make the decisions on matters of law, what the church is bound by, what the church can let go of. So you've got 3 different points of view between Matthew, Luke, and Mark, and John is even more different. I don't know if you want to get into John.
No. Tell us about John.
Well, the interesting thing about John is, in the Synoptic Gospels, Peter plays a major role. He's the first one to be called. In John, he's the third.
Mm-hmm.
He's the first one to state the words, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah.
Right.
John, it's Mary.
Yeah.
And the chief disciple in John seems to be the beloved disciple.
Mm-hmm.
And John doesn't really give Peter his traditional treatment until the 21st chapter, which I think is the second ending, which repeats Luke's call story. And that's the story where John ends by saying, Peter, tend my sheep, feed my lamb.
Yeah. That's really fascinating, because I think that when you grew up in a more conservative or evangelical context, and you were taught to flatten these stories and to harmonize harmonize the Gospels into a single narrative, right? We talk. I talk a good bit about univocality, like that the Bible has one voice and one story, and you actually what you were taught is that strengthens the text, right? Because you get the real story, the whole story. But in fact, my experience is that it weakens the text because you miss the nuance. You miss all of the different messages that when you understand the meaning in the actual context, it gives you much more to think about and to process and to look at your own life through.
It makes it richer and deeper.
Yeah.
I think there's a misnomer about what inspiration means among very conservative Christians. Inspiration means that God inspired every word in the Bible. It's just as God wants it. There are no errors. Therefore, there are no contradictions. All say the same thing. And that's the assumption. So conservative Christians in that vein understand the Bible out of a dictionary definition of the word interpretation. Dictionary is interpreted means God breathed, God.
Right.
There's no contradictions. Whereas if you start with the Bible itself, these 66 books with many, and you say, this is what inspiration looks like. Inspiration looks like many faithful voices talking together, each their own places with their own insights. It's a much richer point of view that makes it possible for us to talk to each other, which is also would be a very good thing to be able to accomplish in our time.
Right. Yeah. It feels like when you do that, it makes some of the characters, some of the people in the scripture very, almost one-dimensional. Like, for example, the Pharisees. I was taught that the Pharisees, growing up, was taught that the Pharisees were very one-dimensional, just like a superhero villain. They were the bad guys. They were the people that when you heard the name, you should hear the dun-dun-dun music, right? One of the things that I think is interesting is this idea of them being much more connected to what is happening especially in the book of Matthew, and really what you're seeing is like a family fight.
Yeah, look, here's a bit of history that we've never heard in church. It's never been preached on the pulpit. It's never been talked about in Sunday school. But what happened after the year 70, when the temple was destroyed? There was a Jewish rabbi who had the inspired notion to leave Jerusalem with the other rabbis, in other words, with the Pharisees, before the temple was destroyed. So he got permission from Vespasian, who was the Roman Empire, who was commanding the troops that had circled Jerusalem. He got permission to start a school in Yavne, which the Hebrew Greek name of the town is Jamnia. It's where Tel Aviv is now. It's about 35 west of Jerusalem on the shore of the Mediterranean. He started a rabbinical school there and basically saved Judaism from annihilation because the center of Jewish religion had been the temple and the sacrifices. And now it became the Torah and the debate over the Torah. And it was a debate over the Torah. There was not one point of view. There were two basic schools, the school of Hillel, the school of Shammai. Shammai was the conservative, the strict constructionist, if you will. Shammai's point of view was that Jews should try to observe the laws as exactly as they can. No, Hillel, on the other hand, was more of a liberal with more of a human-centered point of view. He cared about the spirit of the law. So there's a story about an impatient young rabbinical student who went to Shammai and asked him facetiously to be taught the law while standing on one foot. And Shammai threw him out of the house. Then he went to Hillel and asked the same question, teach me the law while standing on one foot. And Hillel said, what is hateful unto thee, do not do to thy fellow man. That is the law. All the rest is commentary. Sound like, what is hateful unto thee, do to thy fellow man.
Yeah.
Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So I see Jesus, at least as Matthew has interpreted him, as basically picking up the approach to the law that Hillel had. And but look at the conflict stories in Matthew and the other Gospels between Jesus and who he calls the Pharisees. The Pharisees in the story invariably take the strict position of the school of Shammai, while Jesus in the story takes the spirit-centered understanding of the school of Hillel. We never hear that.
Right. Yeah.
Nor have we heard that Mark was written in the context of the temple having been destroyed and people being scared to death.
Right. Right. So, Dr. Orsman, I really have one last question for you. I love the way your book, One Life, Four Stories, really opens up the reading of the gospel accounts. And, a lot of people have either just no religious background or they've had this like deconstruction of religion. And sometimes the Bible seems unknowable or unapproachable because of like, they just don't know where to start. So I'm curious, if you were to talk to people who were approaching the Gospels for the first time or trying to come fresh to them from a history that was not as helpful, maybe one that taught that idea of univocality, where would you have them start? Like, what questions, what lenses would you offer as a place to begin reading these books again?
Okay, so assuming they want to dig into the Gospels, because there are places they can dig in
for sure,
the Bible or in the New Testament. But say the Gospels, my approach would be to say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do many things, but at least one of the things that each of them does is they tell a story. And to read the story, read each of their stories as a story. Look at the plot. Where does it begin? Where does it end? Look at the characters. Pay attention to how Peter is developed because it's different in each one. Look at the setting, the fear in Mark, the desire to expand the mission to the Gentile world in Luke, to as he put it, the family fight between Judaism and Christianity that we find in Matthew, or to making sense of the gospel to a totally Hellenistic world in John. Start with the stories. Try not to assume you know what they already say, which is hard to do.
Right.
But start with something that doesn't make sense to you.
Yeah.
Like start with Mark's ending. The women ran from the tomb and they said nothing to anyone for they were afraid. End of story. What kind of way is that to end a story?
Right, I know.
A story that ends that way. I think that's the avenue into Mark. Or, Matthew, maybe look at chapter 23, which is a problematic chapter. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. It comes across as very anti-Jewish. I don't think that reflects Jesus himself. It reflects the family squabble between Judaism and Christianity going on around the year 90. And try to understand a historical context and a conflict between these two groups that help explain it. Like something else that we don't know about in the church, story's never been told. Sometime around the year 90, the rabbis started calling Christianity heretical.
Right.
Reasons we can understand. They did not believe Jesus was the Messiah because he didn't look like what the Messiah was going to do. And so he was, the rabbis at Yavne were calling the Jewish Christians heretical and accusing the church of not following the gospel, not following the Torah. Start there, try to imagine the conflict, the intractable, ugly conflict between these two families who are getting divorced, so to speak, related to what happens in our lives when a relationship ends painfully. Yeah. And try to read it through that kind of human lens.
Yeah.
Look for what you don't expect to see and try to make sense around it.
Yeah.
And to be aware that there's not one answer as to how to make sense of it.
Right. Yeah.
They say how I've come to understand it, but that's not how you have to come to understand it. You know how to read a story. You've been listening to stories all your life. So trust yourself to interpret a story and to understand it in a completely different way. It may not be orthodox. That's okay. It's biblical.
Yeah. Wow. And, a really great way to find some of those questions and lenses and approaches to reading the Gospels with fresh eyes is to get your book, One Life, 4 Stories. It is brilliant. And I would encourage everyone to check it out. But Dr. Orsman, thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Jeremy, this has been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed getting to know you and hope we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.